Hey, Dr. Lisle, how's the audio on my end?
Good. So far, so good. We'll see how it goes.
All right. Well, if I start chopping up, just take it from there. You'll probably have something more intelligent to say than me anyway. So
we'll just wing it. We'll see how it goes.
Oh wait. Well, anyway, with the show, we are adding a little section here, dating and parenting. So we actually have some interesting news from the evolutionary psychology. Well, it turns out the hypothesis that a bacteria found in cats in subjects actually makes people more sexually aroused with BDSM stimuli, so bondage, dominatrix, submissive and things like that. So this journal suggests that toxoplasmosis can make people more interested in non-conventional sexual practices. So they found that people infected with this express higher attraction to non-conventional sexual practices, but toxoplasmosis infected individuals also reported performing these activities less often than toxoplasma-free individuals. So the difference was not that big. Author Jaroslav Fleger, he's from the University of Charles University in Czech Republic. What he says was that this toxoplasma probably changes sexual behavior of its human host. Some changes, such as increased affinity to BDSM, as observed in infected men, are related to the manipulative activity of the parasite that needs to get from its intermediate host to the stomach of a definitive host. And most of these observed behavioral changes are rather side effects of an impaired health status of the infected subjects. So there we go, Dr. Lisle.
There you go. Very interesting. It's probably... My guess is that that as they're saying, it's a small effect size, and it's probably simply sort of tickling a little circuit that's already potentially there. So it's not like it's inventing a new perspective in human sexual behavior. I think those are latent circuits, and because of the infection, it's probably tickling or facilitating something in a little bit of an odd fashion. Interesting, though.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah, it seems to explain some of the crazy cat ladies that I've come across.
There you go. All right.
Female and alcohol consumption as a short-term mating strategy. So this was actually done in Belgium University. And they were trying to figure out men's perception of female smoking and drinking. And they showed that young men who perceive women who use cigarettes and alcohol as being more sexually unrestricted. So tobacco and alcohol use brought some short-term attractiveness benefits to women. And in short-term mating contexts, drinking enhanced women's attractiveness, whereas occasional smoking was found equal. But in long-term mating contexts, frequent drinking and all smoking behavior was actually harming women's desirability. Then they did another study that confirmed perceptions. They showed that female users of tobacco and alcohol are indeed more short-term oriented in their sexuality. So overall, these results, they show that female smoking and drinking can operate as a bit of a short-term mating strategy.
Yes, it's just straight indicating sort of dopamine reactivity, just sort of looking at more impulsive people. And so, of course, men have picked up that correlation. The correlation is probably fairly high. In other words, if we were to look at women who are smoking and drinking at the same time, particularly in public and plain view, the correlation coefficient between the likelihood of being able to engage in casual mating with that female versus one that is not doing those things is probably a very high correlation. When I say very high, I don't mean it's super high. I just mean that it's a lot better than chance. And so it acts. It's an advertisement for both personality and probably the person's situation as well. So we know, for example, that women show more square inches of skin when they are fertile, when they go out to bars and restaurants and so forth. So so when you add that all together, you have females that are definitely advertising in particular ways for particular mating outcomes. Good. Very cool.
Wow. And if they own a cat, then we all know what to expect out of that short-term mating strategy.
All right. Go ahead. What else you got?
We got another interesting grandparents. Turns out, so there was a new study out of University of Nevada in Las Vegas, and they were trying to figure out whether or not step-grandparents would provide less care and be less emotionally close to grandchildren than would be biological grandparents. And it turns out they actually do. So biological grandmothers provided more direct care, financial investment, and more emotionally close to the grandchild than were biological grandfathers. But step-grandfathers were more emotionally close and more often played with grandchildren than step-grandmothers. So they were trying to figure out why. Well, for the step-grandparents, they were less close in general, but the step-grandfathers were closer, they figured, because this was a mating strategy for the grandfather to be close to the kids. So they were
advertising.
Advertising, yep.
Yeah. Yes. That's exactly what that is. Makes perfect sense. So they have definitely found that stepfathers are advertising to the mates that they're trying to get by being provisioning for offspring. That is clearly their motivation, and I think that they see that. I can't remember how it is that they were able to determine that, but I think in one way, if there's a termination of the primary relationship, then the stepfathers miraculously cut off all, provisioning to step offspring. So this is clearly, we see this as an advertisement strategy of their benefit to the relationship. So obviously, it's no surprise that males bring financial assets to relationships. In other words, what they bring to the relationship in that regard is very important, and it adds to their total cachet. And so therefore, the quote relationship they may have with stepchildren may be very much determined by what's going on between them and the partner. Obviously, now of course there's going to be many exceptions to that, but statistically we're going to see that that's going to be how that's going to work, and that makes perfect sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And this seems like it's in accordance to Hamilton's law. So
Absolutely, yeah. So we would expect, if you think about all life on Earth as simply trying to use energy in order to reproduce DNA within time constraints of their survival time on Earth, then that's essentially that is the biological problem. And of course, then the brains would be shaped in ways to try to optimize those decisions. And so we would expect there to be some quite ruthless calculus that's taking place, not just inside of animals, but certainly inside of humans, to make those decisions as optimally as possible. And that's exactly what it is that we do show. So we're going to be seeing that for the next 100 years in evolutionary psychology. In 50,000 different ways, investigators will always find the same answer, that there is clever mechanisms by which to optimize that transformation of your energy into gene survival. And when it doesn't look like it makes sense, it always does. So the stepfather investigation is a very good one, because on the face of it, it's puzzling to us why that would be happening. And now, of course, all we have to do is see that he's grandstanding for probably his stepdaughter, for God's sakes. So, or his stepson's wife. You know what I'm saying? There's a motivation in that pile somewhere. We just have to look a little bit for it.
Okay. Well, and here's the last one, my favorite one. The the Spanish government just appointed a sex czar. And the reason they did this was to reverse their country's declining population. So they created this new post in an attempt to boost pregnancy rates and halt the country's declining population. And so role of this is taken up by a Ms. Edelmira Barriera Diz, a demographics expert and senator in the Galician parliament. So, again, this year is the first time that they've had a lower number of births than deaths. So, of course, Ms. Barriera has been appointed to head this up and try to reverse this trend. Now, I mean, I don't know. Seems like a good time to go to Spain to come visit, but I think rather than lack of sex here.
Oh my goodness, that's hilarious. All right.
Well, I'll just read one of the questions.
Just so you know, you're
website.
breaking up, Nate.
Okay.
Now,
well,
am I breaking up to you?
No.
Okay. So I'll keep an eye on this, and so whatever we do, if it turns out that we can't track you because you're breaking up, then I'll just take over. We'll see how it goes. Go ahead.
About the
Okay, you're breaking up, so I'm going to go down through. Nate emailed me a list, and so we're going to go down through some questions tonight, and we're going to answer some of these, and we will. And Nate can just shut up. Yeah. All right. You chime in if we can hear you. Are you still there? Yeah, I can't hear him now. Okay. All right. So let's see now. We got some questions. Let me just go down through them. Here's the question from. Let's see. We have a lady here that says, Dr. Lisle, I agree the overall purpose of any organism is to thrive and replicate as programmed by our genes and driven by the instincts derived from our genetic code. Folks, that just sounds like music to my ears. All right. However, what about humans? Okay, this is me, who have no desire to breed whatsoever, or, in fact, are totally abhorrent to the whole idea, process, and outcome. Don't get me wrong, I'm not prudish, strange, repressed, or with any violent or abusive history in this area, and I could easily afford to have many offspring. I've loved practicing to procreate, but I cannot and never have understood why women, quote, want to have children, nor had the urge to get within 1,000 miles of pregnancy. So the question is, am I a total weirdo? Or is this in my genes somehow? What do you think? The deal is that no animal on Earth, other than humans, and only recently, figured out that sex causes children. So our gal here actually is perfectly interested in sex, but not interested in children. And that, of course, the attraction to children and the processes of child raising per se are actually going to be highly subject to individual differences. And so she is genetically what you call not a breeder. Other women are unbelievably interested in that process. So I have known of young teenage women that will walk around with a volleyball under their shirt because they love the idea of that process. So this is clearly an individual difference, and I have little doubt that it is generally a genetic one. And so that is the answer to that. You are in the Stone Age, my dear. You would have had no choice. Nature leaves you no option as far as that goes. Okay. Let's see. So it didn't. It's not a harmful gene. Yes. There you are.
Oh. Okay.
Good.
I'm back. Hopefully this is better now.
Good. Okay. Good. We'll try again. I just answered the first question that you had given
first
me.
one.
All
yeah,
right?
and I was curious because I wonder how much do you think the desire to become pregnant has to do with the great amount of reverence that pregnant women get treated nowadays, and the desire to kind of have that much attention?
I don't know. Maybe it's a very good question. I really couldn't say. I think that all the issues about the psychology around pregnancy are a little bit moot from the evolutionary perspective because pregnancy was never any kind of choice. It was just simply an automatic byproduct of sex, obviously. So the whatever happens today are interesting little cultural perturbations of what might be going on. But the truth of the matter is that you were simply locked into this naturally, and that's that.
Okay.
It also turns out that a lot of times the people who have no interest in children per se are unbelievably interested in their own children. And so they can't anticipate this. They don't, they're simply not, there's a lot of people that are just really not into kids, particularly at all. But when their own child is born, they become unbelievably interested in their children, just like any animal on Earth that is what we're going to call a low reproduction species. So low reproducing species that produce small numbers of offspring, are very attached to those offspring, and that includes basically all humans. All humans all normal humans are extremely interested in the welfare of their offspring, and I have no doubt that includes the person that wrote this question. But she's not going to find out. Okay. All right. Go ahead. Let's go on to the next one.
All right. Next question. I'd like to submit a question regarding suicide. My boyfriend's 33-year-old daughter has been experiencing suicidal ideation and anxiety attacks. Apart from getting into the specifics of her particular situation, what are your general thoughts on how to support someone in this situation, and what kind of medical care, if any, is helpful? And also, what is the evolutionary psychology thinking for why a person would take their own life?
Yes. Okay. First of all, let's back the camera up for just a second and get a little perspective over suicidal ideation and behavior. The suicidal ideation is going to be the first step before we wind up with suicidal behavior, and then suicidal behavior is going to run a gamut of low risk to high risk for whether or not the person actually pulls this thing off. So let's try to figure out why this would be an adaptive mechanism inside the genetic code. So it must be true that if a person, if this is a genetic, if it is an adaptive mechanism, which I believe that it is, the reason why you would expect something would be an adaptive mechanism if it's something that you see species-wide. And so there isn't some little island in Borneo somewhere where they've never heard of suicide and it's never happened. Wherever human beings have walked the earth, there have been suicides. And so the suicides have a pattern, and so they have, most of us have considered suicide at one point or another. And so as a result of that, it indicates that there's circuits in the brain that are essentially suicide circuits. And so those circuits are going to be activated under certain conditions, in the same way that you've got sense of humor circuits that are activated under certain conditions, and you've got thirst mechanisms that are activated under certain conditions. Then suicide circuits will also be activated under certain conditions. And those certain conditions are going to be where there is a cost-benefit analysis where the individual's brain is figuring out that the genes that reside inside that individual may be better served by it being dead than alive. And the question of how that would be possible would be that you're not actually interested in your genes themselves, you're interested in copies of your genes. So the genes are, quote, clever enough to understand that there are copies of themselves located in other bodies. And so specifically, they're located in the bodies of your kin. So that's why animals throughout the world are extremely interested in their kin, and they're not very interested when when the genetics of kinship start to drift out to second and third and then finally fourth-degree relatives. From the standpoint of biology, so first-degree relative, you share half of your unique genes. From a second-degree relative, that would be grandparent, grandchild, or niece-nephew. That's going to be 1/4 of your genes. And then you're going to go out to a cousin, that's going to be 1/8 of your genes. And so so from a cousin, a second cousin is going to be 1/16. I believe from the standpoint of what they can tell through most breeding populations, that when you get out to the level of second cousin, you might as well not be related. In other words, the degree of overlap in the genes is small enough that would have been not atypical in a lot of breeding pools. You wouldn't want to rule out a specimen who you thought was particularly good just because they were a second cousin. So at any rate, the bottom line is this. So the genes are cleverly analyzing, or obviously I use that as a metaphor. The genes aren't doing any thinking. There are neural circuits built by the genes that are designed by nature to solve this problem. And so the problem that they're solving is, would we be better off killing the host that we're sitting in order for that other copies of us to thrive better? And the answer on that would be, well, if obviously this host is itself a generating system for genes, but there's other local generating systems, i.e. first-degree relatives and second-degree relatives, that are important. And it's going to turn out that if we are hurting the prospects of enough of our first-degree and second-degree relatives by our existence, then the gene may be better off with us gone than us here. So this is a person, for example, like Bernie Madoff's kid. So Bernie Madoff's kid, I think it was Bernie Madoff Jr. I don't know if he was a junior or not, but the bottom line, it probably was. I don't know. But the bottom line is...
the Ponzi scheme guy, right?
Yes, right. So Bernie Madoff's kid, who is some 50-year-old man, and I don't know if he was in jail ever or anything else, but bottom line is he killed himself. So this is an example of a nervous system that says, well, now wait a second. I've got kids, so what's in the best interest of my kids? Maybe not for me to be around and a constant reminder to everybody that we ever run into. Better to maybe just bury this horrendous event that my father did, and just sort of cut the chain between us and this social humiliation and my children. And so that is, I have no doubt, like he's not thinking that consciously. His Stone Age brain is running an algorithm and trying to come up with the right answer that statistically maximizes the possibility of gene survival. So the reason why we know that this is what's going on is you will find telltale tracks in the snow that will show you that this is exactly the kind of process that's happening. So when people are humiliated, they're much more likely to commit suicide. They're also much more likely to commit suicide when they have lost a big shot at romance and they're devastated and potentially really embarrassed about it. Or they have had something happen which indicates that their odds of ever being able to reproduce, i.e. to be sexually interesting to anybody, are dramatically reduced, or they've had a major sort of setback in their career, as it were, as far as that goes. Interestingly enough, if they're in chronic pain, that's another example of a system that is basically saying we're getting evidence that you can't get well. We might not want to get that fancy about that one. It can be a much more conscious cost benefit about whether it's even worth it to survive. We don't have to ask evolution for the answer to that question. That's a little more straightforward. The ones that are trickier are like this one. This is a 33-year-old woman, probably not in any chronic pain, but she's experienced suicidal ideation and anxiety attacks. So I don't know what those anxiety attacks look like. I'm sure they're probably quite unpleasant. But there's probably a lot of things about her existence that is puzzling and upsetting, and she's having a hard time competing in some important domains of life. And she can feel that because she's emotionally unstable, that she's sent out a lot of signals to her social environment to get help. And so she has probably cost people in her social environment a lot of time and money to essentially assist her. And those resources are supposed to be a cauldron of reciprocal resources where when you're in trouble and you draw on the village's insurance, you're supposed to be able to heal up and then be a producing member of the village. And probably that for whatever reasons, her deficits have continued indefinitely for a long period of time. So it looks to her like she's nothing other than essentially a drain. And so what will happen then is that suicide circuits start to go off. And then because the system is considering the possibility that it may be in the best interest of the genes to take yourself out, to essentially stop the negative cash flow essentially out of the energy of the coalition. And so then what people will typically do is that they will then do gestures. So they'll cut open an artery sideways. They'll do something that looks scary and dangerous, etc. That's to signal to the village that, hey, I'm really considering this, and people say it's a cry for help, but that's a typical shrink talk because they don't know what they're looking at. It isn't a cry for help per se. It's an assessment. It's actually a brain checking mechanism. The computer inside the one brain that is holding the suicidal individual is checking the computers of the coalition. It's essentially like they're networking in with the other computers. So let's suppose there's half a dozen computers that are first-degree relatives, got a couple of siblings, got a couple of parents, etc. So it's like, okay, I'm thinking about killing myself, and you saw that I made an attempt here that was relatively serious, and I didn't kill myself. I didn't happen to kill myself, but I could have. Enough so that you now can really picture that I wasn't just bluffing before when I was bitching and moaning about how miserable I am. So now you really know. Okay? So now everybody can do one of the following two things. They can say, oh my God, don't you understand how valuable you are? You're the apple of our eye. We know you got problems, but we can get through this. Don't even think that you're being a resource drain. We would just be devastated without you. Oh, well, glad to hear it. Okay? Now, I don't think I'll be thinking about suicide anytime in the near future. So if that's what the reaction is from the coalition, then this is extremely important for that individual. You can imagine a situation where the coalition says, oh, gee, that's kind of, sorry to hear you're having a bad time. Oh, well, did you get some help from the doctor, i.e., I'm not so wild about trying to save you. Okay, so at this point, the individual now is getting feedback from its first-degree relatives to figure out, essentially, how big of a drain am I? How does the system see that it is in fact better off without me? So these are very reasonable algorithms to be inside the system, and that's what it looks like. So anyway, that's the story on suicide. So now the question would be, what would you do about this? Well, obviously, so this is clearly an esteem crisis. It might be a crisis, obviously, of physical pain. That's a little different issue. Person could have psychiatric disorders where they're in a great deal of mental distress independent of the suicidal ideation. That's quite possible. And this person looks like they have panic attacks, which may or may not be that substantial and that important. But what's important here is that it's very likely that the person feels like their feedback from the world in the three major domains which we must compete in by nature, which is mating, friendship, and trade. Those three arenas, if her competitive feedback is substantially below her expectations, then we would expect her to be puzzled and confused and depressed. And so the best solution, when they say what kind of medical care would we give them? Well, I'm not sure what medical care we would give them because we're going to want to keep that person away from antidepressant medications and psychiatrists' biological interventions, I believe, because I don't think there's any evidence to support them, and I think those things are problematic. So what would we want? We would want supportive, sensible therapy, which is probably the most supportive, sensible therapy I would see today would be, an empathic, patient, good personality, cognitive behavioral therapist. That's who I would send her to. And if they can't get rapport with an individual for some reason, get a different one. And so you're looking for sometimes animalistic connections between patient and therapist, and you can't necessarily predict how that's going to happen, but you can look for people who are at least have a generally decent logic to how it is that they think about such things, and that's where I would send that person for care. And that we should be the odds are overwhelming that this person isn't going to commit suicide unless we have a person that has various very unusual characteristics that could happen. It always can, but it usually won't, and it sounds like this is probably an esteem crisis where this person needs some support and coaching into how to become more effective in this life. And miraculously, when people start to become a little bit more effective, the suicidal ideation will disappear. All right? Good enough? Let's go to the next one.
Great. We had a listener that was on hold in the middle of this, but they hung up. So hopefully you answered their question, but if you didn't, feel free to call back, and we'll take the call. Okay, next question. Okay, dear Dr. Lisle, I've been married to my wife for 2 years, and ever since we started dating, I've been jealous here and there in small amounts. But I don't drink, nor have I ever, and every time she goes to drink with her friends, my jealousy gets escalated, and I don't trust the situations. The question I send out, she picks up on, and she doesn't go out, which makes her depressed. I've tried to make myself fine with it, but I can't. She's very social and flirty when she drinks, and it makes me very uncomfortable. I'm not wanting to control her or the relationship, but I feel that the relationship is at risk if she goes and then does what she wants. I want us to be on the same page of what's okay and what's not okay. Is there a right or wrong, or are we just wanting different things that will never change? I feel like I put limits on what I think is acceptable for her to do, and she says I can do whatever I want, that she puts no obstacles in front of me. But I can't help that things don't bother her. What steps can I take so that we can reach a middle ground where both of us feels good about the other's decisions?
Wow. Really tough situation here. And so let me walk through some of this. And obviously there's going to be nuances to this individual situation that I'm going to miss. In other words, I'm not going to get it quite right. So all I can do is I can sort of talk generically about a situation that would look like this one, and I would tell you about what I would be thinking and how it is that I would try to manage the situation and see sort of where this would go. Now, first of all, the first thing we're going to talk about is jealousy in general. So jealousy is a natural reaction that tells the person that their pair bond situation is under threat. So it's going to turn out that in the best relationships, we generally have little smatterings of jealousy will be going on. So, and that's because the person in the relationship on either side of this thing feels very well rewarded, and therefore they feel somewhat vulnerable because they feel like they are sort of at the upper reaches of their competitive reach for the mate value that they're in a relationship with. And so as a result, it's essentially like being paranoid if you're in a job that you're being overpaid by 25%. You're excited about it, and you're sure as heck. The fact that you go to bed at night kind of paranoid that you could lose the job doesn't mean that you don't want to have the job. You still want to have the job, but you're very nervous that you may lose the job. Okay, so that's so jealousy is simply the angry, touchy reaction that feels like you have to mate guard and you've got to worry about it. So a little bit of that is fine. A little bit of that from time to time, if that comes up, is actually a signal of a very healthy relationship. That is a signal of a healthier relationship than if that never comes up, by the way. Now, however, this doesn't look like that. This looks like the jealousy process is asymmetrical. So it looks like our young man here feels jealous, but the female does not feel jealous. And it's also what he's suggesting here about some things that she says are very disturbing. So she says, you can do whatever you want, and I want to do whatever I want, and you do whatever you want. Well, what exactly does that mean? If we translate that into English, does that mean that she wouldn't care if this guy went out to sleazy places and was hitting on women and going home with them and then sleeping with them if he could, et cetera, et cetera. Is that a problem? If her reaction is, well, that's not a problem with me, then we know that we're in the wrong place. Okay, that's a very, on one of two things is happening. That female is not that into this relationship, or number two, we've got a very strange female. Either way, a romantic pair bond psychological situation is in a lot of trouble. So, and going to be very unlikely to be very stable for very long. So, let's look at the possibility that that's not quite what she means. We're going to say that maybe she's like, look, you can go out and flirt with people too. That won't bother me any. And then I want to be able to flirt with people. So, however, now we start looking into how motivated is she to do what, and what is this about? So a great many women in this life wouldn't necessarily want to sleep with attractive men that they bump into, but they would love to have the positive feedback. And so that feels very good to them. And part of what's going on is an ongoing process that goes on your whole life, which is to calibrate your mate value. So you can't very well calibrate your mate value if your husband's right next to you, guarding you, so that you can't sort of test the upper reaches of what it is that you might be able to pull down out of the world. So you can see, and particularly in sort of drinking contexts where casual mating is swirling around, nightclubs, this sort of thing, it's going to turn out that this is going to put women in a position where they're very likely to get fancier feedback on the basis of casual mating advertising than they could ever get in terms of anybody being serious about them being pair bonded. As we remember our thing from earlier today, smoking and drinking, that's extremely attractive because it looks like the female can be had, and therefore that makes them more attractive for casual mating but less attractive for long-term pair bonding. Of course, in the same way, the males swimming through the sea of opportunity at a singles bar are absolutely willing to sleep down. And so the female, let's suppose our girl is a 7 or an 8. If she is, then there might well be 9s or even 10s that are willing to hit on her. This can be giddy and exciting for her, and therefore it's a little bit like a drug-like reaction. It's really fun. Okay, really likes it. Now, it's a little problem if she likes it a heck of a lot and kind of can't get enough of it then, because this is suggesting any number of problems percolating in the situation. So one of the things that I would be interested in doing would be to essentially sit down in a fairly dispassionate fashion and do what I call crystal clear. So crystal clear is when we say, hey, listen, we're going to have a discussion, and I want you to I want to just ask you some questions, and I want you to feel free to say anything. And, I'm not going to fight or tell you to not think those things or not do those things or anything else. I think we need to, we're in some stress here, and we need to kind of open up the whole table, and we have to understand that you may have some feelings, some ideas, and some needs that are going to make me pretty uncomfortable, and I'm going to have to live with that. But I kind of want to understand them, okay? And I'll share with you kind of where it is that I seem to be at. So with that kind of introduction, we say, well, just describe for me what it is that you think, what's fun about this, what do you like about it, because obviously it scares me, but just talk to me, tell me about this, and then be willing to follow up with questions like, have you, in this marriage, this marriage is sort of a big deal these days, and it has all these rules and regulations about it. But how do you really feel about that? I mean, would you like this marriage to be an open marriage, where it is where you could pursue, sexual relationships outside the marriage? And ask that question, and you better be mentally prepared to ask it in a way that has a casual flavor to it, so that we just say, we kind of shrug our shoulders and turn our hands from down on the table to up, like you do in a questioning move. Like, is that like, hey, like, i.e., If the answer is you'd like to do that, I can handle it. I'm not going to blow up and freak out. Okay? So we ask the question because we want to be very, very clear. And you may find that she says, no, not at all. I just really like this feedback. Okay? Then that's going to be important for you to know that, and it's going to be important for you to hear that. But you're only going to hear it honest if you ask the question in a way that appears very open to hearing whatever the answer is and even anticipating what that answer may be. This is what I call, feeding them the multiple choice. So if you have something to ask somebody that is very difficult for them to tell you what it is, then you can't ask them. You cannot ask them an open-ended question to have them tell you. You must tell them what it is and put the words out in the air so that they can see that you're not freaked by those words and that concept. Okay? So that's why we begin open and wide and say, what are you searching for? What is it that you like? How does it you feel about this? How do you see yourself doing this? Is this something that you feel like you want to do for, the next few years? Or give me a little feel for that. And then after we demonstrate that we are open to listening, then we say, I'm just trying to get a feel for really where you're at with this. If you were flirting with some handsome guy and he wanted to give you his phone number and maybe meet up with you a week later or a few days later, and you felt like having a fling with him, I mean, is this kind of what it is that you're, would you want to have this marriage be kind of open to that? And when you ask that question, once you ask it, I'm going to give you a little bit of advice. You shut up. Okay? You shut up. You ask the big question, and then you shut up and you look calmly. Okay? And you watch for what's going on with them. And you see and you try to communicate to them, i.e., I can handle the truth. And that's a key question in this whole thing. So we need to do crystal clear, and we need to be very careful about how we ask those questions. And the reason for this is that then you know where you're at. Okay? And so we're not in any big rush to make any decisions about this relationship and where it would go because we don't know where it is right now. It's all unclear. So there's a lack of clarity, and ultimately where we would have to head with this is to where what I call a position of power. And the position of power that the young man needs to arrive at is that once you understand the situation, then you can then you have to decide that you're going to run an experiment on how it is that you're going to let things go. So are you going to say, well, I'll tell you what, let's let this go for a year. Let's see what happens to this. She just wants to go out and flirt, etc. And I'm going to look at this in a year and see if she gets out of her system. And at the end of a year, we'll see where we are, see whether I can tolerate it. Okay? So you put yourself in a position where you give a timeline to the decision on this relationship, and you let the evidence come to you. And after a year of this more, you may decide, you know what, this is obviously the needs that she has cannot be had, and the needs that I have cannot be had, and we have ultimately too much conflict of interest, and this relationship isn't going to fly. No problem, okay? We're not there yet. And one of the reasons we're not there yet is we don't actually know specifically what's in her head. And one of the reasons we don't know specifically what's in her head is because we haven't asked in a way that we can get it, okay? So the most important thing we do is ask in a way that we can get to the information. And we may have to take 2 or 3 passes at this. So she may clam up and lie the first time around. That's okay. No problem. We see how far we get. We demonstrate to her that we're not freaked out, whatever the answer is. And then we come back and visit this thing a couple months later, okay? And we attack it from 7 degrees different off center. We ask the question slightly differently. We move the same direction. We make the same similar moves. And now we ask a question again. And now the second time, 2 months from now, she may cough it up that, in fact, she would very much like to have the marriage open. Okay? So if that's where we are, then you don't make any decisions then. You walk away and you think about it. Okay? And so this is how it is that we we attack a problem of this magnitude. All right, I think that's enough on that one. We'll go on to something else.
Okay. Next question. What is the evolutionary purpose of female menopause? Does it decrease the probability of a long-term pair bond, given that the female's hormone profile undergoes significant changes?
The purpose of menopause is probably to divert female energies to grandchildren. So it's probably what it is. By the time a female goes into menopause, she is her children, her adult children, would now be having children, and so as a result of that, nature basically says you're in a lot of trouble. You probably don't have the chops to survive all the way through and provision another new birth at age 48. So as a result, what we're going to do is, instead of you having a very chancy kid with a lot of mutations because the eggs are old, and put a bunch of your life's energy into that, the genes have figured out that we're better off of you putting your life's energy into grandchildren. So I think it's obvious that this is a unique characteristic of humans. One of the most striking unique characteristics is it's as unique as language. I don't believe there's anywhere else in the animal kingdom where parents are where grandparenthood exists. And notice the fascination and attention that parents have for their children's mating choices. It's unbelievable. Okay, this is just not like anything else you see in nature. So this tells us something very interesting about the genes of this species, and that is the brain is so big and so crafty, it is actually thinking through the genetic interests of the organism transgenerationally, which is never going to take place in any other species. So it looks like it's a grandmothering system, and it basically says, hey, it's time to invest in grandkids and not so much yourself. This is also very interesting that female sexuality interest in their, particularly as we survey it today, females, women in their 50s and 60s, tend to be quite uninterested in sex, far less interested in sex than their husbands. So this is again cannot possibly be an accident. This is a shifting of interest in behavior towards something else that is valuable for the genes, which is grandmotherhood, clearly. So this doesn't mean that people, women over 50 are never interested in sex. That's not what it means. It just means that we see a characteristic shift of interests that is quite remarkable. So now the next part of the question is, does this reduce the probability of a long-term pair bond? I'm not sure exactly what they're saying. It's certainly going to possibly put pressure on a pair bond because the male is going to still be interested in reproducing. And so if the female is not very interested, it's certainly that conflict of interest should put pressure on a pair bond. And that wouldn't surprise me any, but that doesn't mean that in principle, I think that pressure, essentially the fact that the female in general is going to be less interested in romance and sex and more interested in little tiny critters that have her genes in them, I think that is a conflict of interest that a postmenopausal female brings into mating relationships. Now, probably what we're going to see is that these changes are, my guess is that you're going to see them more later in menopause than early. Because I believe that females early in menopause, let's suppose you're 45 years old in the Stone Age and you just had your last, so it should, now you're heading into menopause and let's say you're infertile by 48. I would expect that the system would still be interested in fooling the male who is the father of that child into thinking that further sexual activity would result in more children. so I believe that females would still be motivated during menopause and in the early years of menopause into essentially, obviously, completely this is not part of the conscious manipulative strategy of a female, but we probably come from a long line of female ancestors who maintained sexual interest to some degree in the early years post-menopause because they were still bluffing the males into thinking that there were still some eggs there, and therefore that this sexual activity was a worthy harvest, and therefore getting provisions for the existing offspring. And so then I would expect, after the normal level of provisioning, that a male would probably stick around, which might be 5 to 7 years, that at that point it's time to give up the ghost. And so that's probably how that goes. That would be my guess.
Okay. And any amount of menopause isn't is it nature's way of not competing with her daughters and granddaughters for other mates?
I don't think so. I think that's that would presuppose that there was that there would be. I mean, it's sort of an interesting idea. I don't think so. No, I think I don't think that that's probably a factor in there. I think that's more what I'm talking about. It's time to simply, because you have such a long cycle to make a human child viable, that literally nature just ran the payoff matrix. Chimpanzees, I believe a female chimpanzee who maybe lived 50 years is perfectly fertile all the way to the end. That's probably because a 1 or 2 year old chimpanzee could probably make it. Okay, whereas a 2-year-old kid doesn't. 2-year-old human has no chance. And so the individual differences in how fast development brings a viable organism would be the telltale sign of when it would pay to quit reproducing and start essentially investing in ancillary offspring.
Interesting.
All right.
Great questions for listeners. We really appreciate it. Send in some more, and in a couple of shows we'll have some more listener emails and questions. Dr. Lisle, thanks again as always.
Great. Great pleasure. Yeah.
Oh, that's my cat. I'm sorry.
Holy smoke. We won't ask anything about your sexual practices. None. I'm not asking that question. All right.
Thanks
very
everybody
good.
for listening. We'll talk to you all next week.
Good night, folks.